The restaurant was one of the finest in town, known for its warm atmosphere and delicious food. It wasn't the kind of place that tried too hard to be fancy, but everything about it, from the soft lighting to the carefully prepared dishes, spoke of quality. The staff worked hard to make sure every customer had a pleasant experience. But that evening, things were about to take a different turn. Margaret Sinclair stepped into the restaurant with an air of importance, her expensive heels clicking against the polished floor. She was a woman who had everything: money, designer clothes, and a lifestyle most could only dream of. But along with her wealth came an attitude that many found difficult to tolerate. She believed that money made her superior, and she never missed a chance to remind people of it. As she entered, she wrinkled her nose slightly, looking around as if searching for something to complain about. The restaurant was elegant, but Margaret always found faults where none existed. She let out a sigh and walked toward an empty table, barely acknowledging the hostess who greeted her with a polite smile. A few moments later, a waitress named Emily approached with a warm smile and a notepad in hand. "Good evening, ma'am. Welcome. May I get you something to drink while you look at the menu?" she asked kindly. Margaret looked Emily up and down, taking in her simple uniform and the slight wariness in her eyes. She assumed Emily was just another lowly worker trying to make ends meet. A small smirk appeared on her lips. "Water," Margaret said dismissively, waving her hand as if she were too important to be bothered with unnecessary conversation. Emily nodded politely and hurried to fetch the drink. But as she placed the glass of water on the table, a single drop splashed onto the white tablecloth. It was barely noticeable, something most people wouldn't even care about. But Margaret saw it, and her expression turned cold. She clicked her tongue in annoyance. "Seriously, you can't even serve a simple glass of water properly? Is this how you treat all your customers?" Emily's cheeks flushed slightly, not because she was embarrassed, but because she knew exactly the type of person she was dealing with. She had seen people like Margaret before, those who thought kindness was a weakness and respect was something only money could buy. Still, she kept her calm. "I'm very sorry about that, ma'am. I'll bring you a fresh napkin." Margaret let out a dramatic sigh. "I don't understand why restaurants hire people who can't even do their jobs right." She shook her head as if truly disappointed. "I expect better service when I dine somewhere, but I suppose places like this don't care about quality anymore." Emily didn't respond to the insult. Instead, she simply nodded and walked away, her expression unreadable. She had dealt with difficult customers before, but something told her that Margaret was about to learn an important lesson tonight, one she would never forget. Margaret tapped her manicured fingers on the table, her expression one of impatience. She glanced around the restaurant, watching the other customers enjoying their meals and chatting with the friendly staff. She didn't understand how people could settle for such an average place. To her, true luxury was eating at five-star restaurants where the staff treated her like royalty. A few moments later, Emily returned with the fresh napkin and placed it gently on the table. "Here you go, ma'am. Would you like to hear the specials for today?" she asked, her voice polite and steady. Margaret barely looked at her. "Just bring me the most expensive dish you have," she said with a dismissive wave of her hand. Then, as if noticing Emily properly for the first time, she smirked slightly. "Unless, of course, you don't even know what that is." Emily remained calm, though she could sense the mocking tone in Margaret's words. She had served all kinds of customers before, kind ones, difficult ones, and those who believed the world revolved around them. But she never let their behavior change the way she treated them. "We have a chef's special seafood dish that's quite popular. Would you like me to place the order for you?" she asked kindly. Margaret let out a small laugh, shaking her head. "Seafood. That's the best thing you have." She sighed dramatically. "I should have known. This place is far from fine dining. But I suppose I'll just have to deal with it." Emily gave a small nod and walked away to place the order. As she did, Margaret leaned back in her chair and muttered to herself, "Some people just don't have any ambition." She glanced at Emily's retreating figure and shook her head in disapproval. Still working as a waitress at her age. How unfortunate. A few minutes later, another customer, a well-dressed businessman, walked past Margaret's table and smiled at Emily as she served a nearby table. "Good to see you again, Emily. Your restaurant never disappoints," he said warmly. Margaret overheard the conversation and raised an eyebrow. Her restaurant? That couldn't be right. Maybe he was mistaken. She shook off the thought and focused on her meal, which had just arrived. As Emily carefully placed the dish in front of her, Margaret smirked and said, "Tell me, Emily, how long have you been working here? Must be tiring running around serving people all day." Emily simply smiled. "I don't mind it, ma'am. I enjoy what I do." Margaret chuckled softly. "Enjoy. That's an interesting way to put it. I suppose some people are just comfortable with where they are in life." She took a bite of her meal, still smirking. "But personally, I could never imagine being stuck in a job like this." Emily remained quiet, letting Margaret say what she wanted. She knew the truth would come out soon enough. And when it did, Margaret was going to be in for a big surprise. The restaurant continued to bustle with the usual hum of chatter, clinking silverware, and the soft background music. Emily moved between tables, offering smiles and warm service to each customer. Despite Margaret's rude comments, she remained composed, focused on doing her job well. She didn't take the harsh words personally. After all, she had learned long ago not to let negativity get to her. Margaret, however, seemed to be getting more frustrated with each passing minute. She took another bite of her meal, her eyes narrowed as she glanced at Emily. It wasn't just the service that bothered her. It was the entire atmosphere of the restaurant. She found it too average, too ordinary for her tastes. After a few minutes, she raised her hand in the air, signaling for Emily to come over again. When Emily approached, Margaret looked her up and down once more, her expression still judgmental. "I have to say," Margaret began, her tone dripping with sarcasm, "this place isn't nearly as impressive as I thought it would be. The food's decent, I'll admit, but the service? Well, let's just say it's subpar." She leaned back in her chair, folding her arms across her chest. Emily's face remained calm, but inside, she couldn't help but feel the sting of Margaret's harsh words. Still, she knew better than to engage in an argument. She had seen customers like Margaret before, people who believed their wealth gave them the right to treat others poorly. But she also knew something that Margaret didn't. Kindness and patience were far more powerful than any insult. "I'm sorry to hear that, ma'am," Emily replied politely. "We always strive to make sure our guests have the best experience. If there's anything I can do to make your meal more enjoyable, please don't hesitate to let me know." Margaret scoffed. "Well, it's a bit late for that, isn't it? You could have tried harder from the beginning. But I guess you're used to people like me not complaining." She shook her head as if pitying Emily. At that moment, the manager, James, appeared at the table. He had been watching the interaction from afar and could see that things were starting to escalate. He approached with a friendly smile, hoping to ease the tension. "Good evening, ma'am," James said smoothly. "I'm James, the manager. I wanted to personally check in to see if everything is going well with your meal." Margaret looked at him briefly, then waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, it's fine, I suppose," she said, clearly uninterested. "But I have to say, your staff doesn't seem to have much of a clue about high-end service. It's honestly a little embarrassing." James's smile didn't falter, but his eyes sharpened slightly. He had dealt with difficult customers before, but he wasn't about to let anyone belittle his staff. "I'm truly sorry you feel that way, ma'am. Emily is one of our best waitresses, and I can assure you, she takes great pride in her work. If there's anything specific you'd like to address, I'd be happy to help." Margaret rolled her eyes, clearly unimpressed by his calm demeanor. "It's fine. Just get me the check already. I can't be bothered to stay in this mediocre place any longer." James nodded, giving Emily a quick glance before walking away. He could tell Emily was doing her best to keep her composure, but he also knew she didn't deserve to be treated this way. As he left to bring the check, Emily took a deep breath and glanced over at Margaret one more time. She wasn't angry, just determined to handle this situation with grace. Little did Margaret know, she was about to learn a lesson she wouldn't soon forget. The restaurant's atmosphere remained as calm and cozy as ever, with gentle laughter and the clinking of plates in the background. However, at Margaret's table, the tension was palpable. Emily, despite the uncomfortable encounter, continued with her work as if nothing had happened. She remained focused on her duties, serving other customers with a smile. As she moved around the restaurant, Emily couldn't help but notice Margaret's continued grumbling. The wealthy woman seemed increasingly agitated as she waited for her check, her impatience growing with each passing minute. Emily was used to this kind of behavior, but that didn't make it any easier. Still, she refused to let it affect her. A few moments later, the manager, James, returned with the check in hand, a quiet smile still present on his face. He had a calm, composed way of handling situations, especially those involving difficult customers. He stood at the edge of Margaret's table and glanced down at her. "Here's your check, ma'am," James said politely. "Again, I truly apologize that your experience didn't meet your expectations. If there's anything more we can do for you, please let us know." Margaret glanced up at him, barely acknowledging his presence. "Whatever," she muttered under her breath. "Just get me out of here." She waved her hand dismissively, as if trying to shoo him away. James's smile remained, but his eyes softened with understanding. He had worked in customer service for many years and had learned that sometimes the best way to handle people like Margaret was to simply give them space. He placed the check on the table and turned to walk away, but before he could leave, something unexpected happened. Emily, who had been quietly observing from the corner of the room, stepped forward. She had kept her distance, not wanting to make the situation worse, but now she decided it was time to say something. Her calm demeanor and warm smile never wavered as she approached Margaret's table once more. "Ma'am, I just wanted to take a moment to say thank you for dining with us today," Emily said, her voice gentle but steady. "It was a pleasure to serve you." Margaret looked up, clearly surprised. She hadn't expected Emily to address her again. "Why are you still here?" she asked, her tone almost irritated. Emily, however, remained unfazed. "I just wanted to let you know that we do our best to ensure every guest has a pleasant experience. I hope you enjoyed your meal, despite any concerns you may have had." Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but something about Emily's calm, polite attitude made her stop. There was no anger in Emily's voice, no defensiveness. It was as if she had accepted Margaret's complaints, but didn't take them personally. Margaret felt a twinge of guilt, something she wasn't used to feeling. Emily gave her one final smile and began to walk away. But before she could leave, Margaret's voice, though still a bit cold, stopped her. "Wait." Emily turned around, slightly surprised. "Yes, Mom. I just wanted to say." Margaret hesitated for a moment, clearly struggling with her words. "I didn't mean to be so harsh earlier. It wasn't fair to you." Emily nodded, her expression still calm. "It's all right, Mom. I understand. Thank you for saying that." Margaret sat back in her chair, staring down at the check, as if lost in thought. Something about the way Emily had handled the situation had made her pause. It wasn't what she had expected, nor what she was used to. And for the first time in a long while, Margaret found herself feeling just a little bit uncomfortable. As Emily continued with her duties, she couldn't help but wonder if Margaret had learned something today, or if this encounter would soon be forgotten. But regardless of the outcome, Emily knew she had done her best to handle the situation with kindness and professionalism. And sometimes, that was all anyone could do. After the brief exchange, Emily continued to move around the restaurant, serving other guests and taking orders. The evening carried on as usual, the restaurant filled with the sounds of pleasant conversation and the clinking of dishes. But for Emily, something had changed. Her mind kept drifting back to Margaret, wondering if she truly understood what had just happened, or if it was simply another customer who would leave without ever realizing the impact of their words. Margaret, on the other hand, sat in silence at her table. Her meal was almost finished, but she wasn't in much of a hurry to leave anymore. The earlier anger that had clouded her thoughts was slowly starting to fade, replaced by something unfamiliar, a quiet reflection. She stared at the check in front of her, wondering how she had managed to treat Emily so poorly when all the waitress had done was try to be kind. As the last few customers enjoyed their meals and chatted among themselves, James, who had noticed Margaret's change in behavior, took the opportunity to step up and check on her once again. "Is everything to your satisfaction now, ma'am?" he asked, his voice gentle but sincere. He hadn't seen Margaret act this quiet or thoughtful all evening. Margaret blinked, as if pulled out of her thoughts. She looked up at James, her expression a little less harsh than before. "Yes, it's fine," she said softly, her tone much different from when she had first entered. "The meal was good, actually. I didn't realize how, I don't know, rude I was being." James nodded understandingly. "It happens. Sometimes we all have moments when we're not at our best. It's what we do next that matters." Margaret didn't respond immediately. She looked back down at the table, her hands folding around the check as she thought about James's words. What we do next? She had never really considered that before. For most of her life, Margaret had always been quick to judge and criticize. It was her way of maintaining control in a world that seemed to constantly demand more from her. But now, something felt different. Something about Emily's calm response had made her pause. Emily hadn't reacted with anger or frustration. Instead, she had responded with kindness. That, Margaret realized, was what had made the difference. Margaret felt a sense of embarrassment rise within her. She had thought she was better than everyone in this place, better than Emily. But now she wasn't so sure. She hadn't known who Emily really was, or the kind of person she was. I think I owe her an apology," Margaret murmured, mostly to herself. "I shouldn't have treated her that way." James gave a small, encouraging smile. "It's never too late to make things right." Margaret sat there, lost in thought for a moment longer. She knew that her behavior had been harsh, even if she hadn't meant it. But now she felt a strange sense of guilt and a desire to make amends. After a few minutes, she stood up, her decision made. She grabbed her purse, paid the bill, and walked to the counter to leave. But just before she stepped out of the door, something stopped her. It was the sound of Emily's voice, the same soft tone she had used earlier. "Thank you for coming, ma'am. I hope you have a pleasant evening." Margaret hesitated, then turned around. She looked at Emily, who was smiling warmly, despite the earlier tension. I wanted to say I'm sorry," Margaret said, her voice softer than usual. "I didn't treat you right. I was rude, and that wasn't fair to you." Emily's smile remained. "I appreciate that, ma'am. It means a lot." Margaret nodded, feeling a weight lift off her shoulders. She hadn't expected this kind of humbling moment to happen. But it had, and in a strange way, it had been a moment of growth. Margaret knew that, from this point on, she would approach the world a little differently. Maybe, just maybe, she would start to see people for who they really were, not just based on how they looked or what they could do for her. With a final, respectful nod, Margaret left the restaurant. She walked out the door with a sense of quiet satisfaction, knowing that she had done something she rarely did. She had admitted she was wrong, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a little more at peace with herself. The next morning, Margaret woke up feeling different, lighter, somehow. She had spent most of the night reflecting on what had happened at the restaurant, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of humility. It wasn't that she was used to admitting she was wrong. Quite the opposite, in fact. But last night's encounter had made her realize something important about herself and about others. As she sipped her morning coffee, Margaret found herself thinking more about Emily. She hadn't expected the young waitress to leave such an impression on her. Most people, especially those working in service, didn't usually stick out in her mind. They were just a part of the background to her busy, upscale life. But something about Emily's calmness, her kindness despite Margaret's harsh words, had stayed with her. Margaret found herself wondering what kind of person Emily was outside of work. She'd assumed the waitress was just another person trying to make ends meet, stuck in a job that wouldn't lead to anything better. But now, after their conversation, she wasn't so sure. Emily had handled the entire situation with grace, something Margaret wasn't used to seeing in people, especially not people she thought were beneath her. Throughout the day, Margaret couldn't shake the thought of the restaurant from her mind. She thought about the way she had treated the staff, the way she had dismissed the manager's attempts to engage with her politely. And as the day wore on, she began to feel an unfamiliar sense of guilt. Guilt for how she had acted. Guilt for how she had assumed things about others without taking the time to understand them. At work, Margaret went through the motions, handling business meetings and phone calls as she always did. But even as she dealt with the demands of her job, a part of her couldn't stop thinking about that evening and about the people who worked at the restaurant. She had never really noticed the effort it took to run a place like that. How much care and attention went into making each guest feel welcome. Later in the afternoon, Margaret found herself standing by the window of her office, looking out over the city. It was a quiet moment, one that seemed to stretch on longer than usual. Her mind wandered back to Emily, to the way the young woman had smiled at her despite everything. Margaret had always believed that wealth and status were what mattered most, but now she wasn't so sure. Maybe, just maybe, kindness and respect were worth more than any amount of money. That evening, after finishing work, Margaret made a decision. She would return to the restaurant. It wasn't just about making amends for the way she had treated Emily. It was about understanding something deeper. She wanted to know more about the people she had judged so quickly, to hear their stories and learn from them. As she drove to the restaurant, she felt a mixture of nervousness and curiosity. This wasn't just a simple apology. She wanted to see things from a different perspective, to break free from the bubble she had built around herself. She parked her car outside, took a deep breath, and walked into the restaurant once again. The familiar chime of the door opening greeted her as she stepped inside. The restaurant was quieter this evening, with only a few guests scattered at their tables. Emily wasn't busy, but Margaret wasn't sure if she would be recognized. She hesitated for a moment, then approached the host station. "Good evening," Margaret said, trying to sound casual, though there was a hint of nervousness in her voice. "I'd like to speak with Emily, if she's available." The hostess nodded, giving her a polite smile. "Of course, ma'am. I'll let her know you're here." As the hostess walked away to find Emily, Margaret took a seat at a nearby table, her heart beating faster than usual. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew this was an important step. She couldn't undo the past, but she could at least try to make things right moving forward. A few moments later, Emily appeared at the table, her eyes bright as she recognized Margaret. There was no sign of judgment or discomfort in Emily's expression, just a calm, welcoming smile. "Hello, Mom," Emily greeted her warmly. "How can I help you today?" Margaret took a deep breath, gathering her words. "I just wanted to say thank you and apologize. I didn't treat you well the other night, and I've been thinking about it ever since. I'm sorry for how I acted." Emily blinked, clearly surprised by the apology, but the smile never left her face. "Thank you, ma'am. That means a lot. I appreciate it." Margaret nodded, feeling the weight lift off her shoulders. She wasn't sure where this conversation would go, but for the first time, she felt like she was doing the right thing. And that was enough. Margaret sat at the table, feeling an unusual sense of calm wash over her as she looked across at Emily. The young woman's warm smile was genuine, without any hint of resentment or discomfort. In that moment, Margaret realized that something had changed, not just in her, but in the atmosphere of the entire encounter. For the first time, she felt like she was truly seeing Emily, not as someone beneath her or as a mere servant, But as a person with her own thoughts, emotions, and experiences, she couldn't remember the last time she had taken the time to get to know someone who worked in a role like Emily's. "I've been thinking a lot about our last interaction," Margaret began, her voice softer than it had been before. "I know I was rude to you, and I can't just ignore that. I've treated people like you as if you don't matter, but that's wrong." Emily nodded, her expression still calm. "It's okay, ma'am. I understand. A lot of people don't always realize how they come across." Margaret smiled faintly, a little embarrassed by how much truth there was in Emily's words. She had always prided herself on her sharp business instincts and her ability to control situations, but this was different. She wasn't in charge here. And for once, that was okay. "I've spent so much of my life focusing on what's next, on getting ahead, on keeping up with my own expectations," Margaret said, her voice thoughtful. "But I haven't really stopped to consider the people who helped me along the way. I've been blind to them, and I think that's been a mistake." Emily listened carefully, not interrupting. She could see that Margaret was struggling, but it was a good kind of struggle, one that meant Margaret was reflecting on her actions and beginning to see things from a different perspective. "I don't know what made me act the way I did the other night," Margaret continued, her voice quiet now. "I guess I felt entitled to everything around me. But I realize now that I don't have the right to treat people like that, no matter who they are or what they do." Emily smiled, a small but meaningful gesture. "It's never easy to admit when we've been wrong. But you did, and that shows a lot of strength." Margaret felt a wave of gratitude toward Emily. She had expected to find judgment, but instead, all she had found was understanding. The weight in her chest seemed to lessen with each passing word. "Thank you for giving me that opportunity," Margaret said, her voice sincere. "I know I can't undo the past, but I want to do better going forward. I want to see people for who they really are, not just for what I think they should be." Emily nodded. "That's all anyone can ask for. We all have moments where we mess up, but what matters is what we choose to do after. You're already making things right." For a long moment, the two women just sat there in silence. Margaret found herself at peace, more than she had been in years. There was no rush to get to the next thing, no pressure to keep moving forward. Instead, she was able to just be present, in the moment, and truly connect with someone in a way she hadn't allowed herself to before. Finally, Margaret broke the silence. "I'd like to come back again. Not just because I feel like I need to make things right, but because I want to get to know this place. I want to appreciate the people who make it run." Emily smiled once more, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "You're welcome any time, ma'am. We'd be happy to have you back." Margaret stood up, feeling lighter than she had in a long time. She reached for her purse, ready to pay for the meal, but Emily stopped her with a gentle hand. "On the house," Emily said, still smiling. "For your kindness." Margaret looked at her, surprised. "Are you sure?" Emily nodded. "I'm sure. You've made an effort to make things right. That's more than enough." Margaret's heart warmed at the gesture. She had come here expecting to make amends, but she left with something even more valuable. A lesson in humility, respect, and kindness. It was something she had never truly learned before, but now she knew it was something she would carry with her for the rest of her life. As she walked out of the restaurant, Margaret felt a renewed sense of purpose. She was determined to approach life with a new outlook, one that focused on understanding, kindness, and respect for others. It wasn't always going to be easy, but she knew it was the right path. And for the first time in a long time, Margaret felt ready to walk it. The following weeks were full of quiet reflection for Margaret. Every time she thought about the restaurant, she remembered her conversation with Emily and how much it had changed her outlook. Margaret had always been someone who focused on the next goal, the next success, but now she understood the importance of slowing down and appreciating the people around her. She returned to the restaurant several times after that night. Each visit was different from the last. Margaret wasn't there to apologize anymore. She was there to learn. She began to take time to chat with the staff, to ask them about their lives and how they ended up working there. She even spent a few hours one afternoon in the kitchen, watching the chefs prepare meals and understanding the hard work that went into making every dish. The more Margaret learned, the more her respect for everyone at the restaurant grew. She realized that each person she had once viewed as just a worker had their own story, their own dreams, and their own struggles. The waitstaff, the cooks, the managers, everyone had a part to play in making the restaurant a success. And without them, the place wouldn't run as smoothly as it did. Margaret also started noticing the small things that made the restaurant special. The way the waiters always remembered a customer's favorite dish, the quiet care the kitchen staff took in preparing each meal, making sure it was perfect. She began to appreciate the atmosphere, the little details that made the restaurant feel warm and inviting. It wasn't just about the food, it was about the people behind it. One day, as Margaret sat at a table, enjoying her meal and reflecting on how far she had come, Emily came over to check on her. There was something different in the way Margaret looked at her now, not as the waitress she had once dismissed, but as someone who had taught her a valuable lesson. "How are you today, ma'am?" Emily asked with a smile. "I'm good, thank you," Margaret replied, her voice thoughtful. "Actually, I've been thinking a lot about the changes I've made since I first came here. I never realized how much I took for granted." Emily nodded, her expression warm. "It's not always easy to see things differently, but I'm glad you've had that realization." Margaret smiled back. "It's been a humbling experience. I've started looking at people in a different way, especially those who work behind the scenes. I can't believe how much I used to overlook." Emily's smile widened. "It's not uncommon. A lot of people don't see what goes into making things happen. But when you take the time to notice, you realize how much everyone contributes." Margaret nodded, appreciating Emily's words. "I think I'm finally starting to understand that. I've spent so much of my life focusing on my own success that I forgot to appreciate the efforts of others. I was blind to how much we rely on each other." Emily sat down for a moment, as if she had all the time in the world, though she was still on the clock. "I think you're doing great," she said with sincerity. "It's not easy to admit when we've been wrong, but you've shown a lot of courage by taking the time to change." Margaret felt a sense of gratitude that she hadn't expected. It wasn't just about her change of perspective. It was about the kindness she had received from Emily, the people at the restaurant, and the lesson in humility that had come from it all. "You know," Margaret said, "I think it's time for me to start paying it forward. I've learned that kindness and understanding are more important than anything I've ever achieved. I want to be the kind of person who helps others see their worth." Emily smiled softly. "I think you'll do just that. It's all about making the choice to see the best in people. And that's a choice you've already made." Margaret left the restaurant that evening with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. She had come to understand that true success wasn't measured by wealth or status. It was about the impact you had on the people around you, the kindness you shared, and the respect you showed to everyone, no matter their background or job. In the weeks that followed, Margaret started volunteering at local charities, offering her time and resources to causes that were close to her heart. She found joy in helping others and in using her influence to make a difference. The old Margaret, the one who had been focused solely on her own success, began to fade, replaced by a new woman, one who truly understood what it meant to connect with others. And every time she returned to the restaurant, she was reminded of the valuable lesson Emily had taught her. That sometimes the most important things in life weren't the things you could touch or buy, but the people you could connect with and the kindness you could give.